Hello, everyone. It's a real honor and a thrill to be up here discussing an issue of such urgency and importance. The problem of suffering is not a problem that is confined to atheists or agnostics. It's in fact a problem even more intensely felt by the believer. Because for the atheist, in some ways, suffering is not a problem. There is no God, so this is just the way the world is. For the believer, however, you always have to ask, why does God permit, tolerate, cause a world that looks like the one we have? Now, in some senses, this is a very difficult question to raise because we are second-guessing God. We're basically saying God is an architect. He made the world this way, and we think he could have done better. Bart Ehrmann says, in a sense, how do we make sense of the world? So the first problem we have, I think, as not just Christians, but as thinking people is, what position are we in to judge the architecture of the universe? In other words, before we undertake a project of reason to explain something, you've got to ask, am I in possession of adequate facts to comment intelligently on the matter at hand? If you show up and somebody says, here's a bunch of clues, don't look at them, but tell me who the murderer is, you'll say, well, I can't. I don't know what these clues actually mean. If you go into a mall, or you're outside in the parking lot, and you see a big SUV, and the door is open, and there's a 2-year-old child in a car seat, but it's hot, and there's no mom anywhere to be seen, what do you say? Do you say that this mom is a negligent person who should be immediately arrested and locked up because she has no idea how to look after her child? No, because you don't know the mom. She might have excellent reason for running out of that SUV. Maybe her husband is in Starbucks and just had a heart attack. And since you are not in full possession of the relevant facts, you hold back a little bit. You don't know the circumstances over there. And so here we are, human beings. We are part of the universe. And we are second-guessing the blueprint of the entire universe. So my first question is, are we really in full possession of adequate facts to be able to say, we think God could have done better? That's the question that's worth thinking about. Does our human reason have that kind of a compass? Or are we rather more like the ant or the dog, which if given an algebra problem can use all its reason, but still wouldn't in fact solve the problem? Not because there isn't a solution, but because the abilities of the ant are not adequate to comprehend it, or not in possession of the adequate data to give an adequate answer. Now, when we think about evil, when we think about suffering, in some ways to me this is not a problem about the existence of God. You can say it's a problem about the character of God. In some ways, very often people say there's so much suffering in the world, therefore we are very doubtful that there is a God who exists, who would permit such a thing. But let's imagine, for instance, that I have a dad who's very powerful, who has near infinite resources. Let's say my dad is Bill Gates. And I consider him to be a very loving dad and a very powerful man, and I look to him whenever I'm in difficulty. And then I come across a really serious problem in my life, and I look to my father and say, help me, and he won't help. He isn't there. So what do I conclude? Do I say, well, my dad does not exist? No. I simply say, maybe my dad isn't quite the guy I thought he was. Maybe I need to reassess my relationship with my dad. Maybe my dad isn't the person I suspected him to be. In other words, I begin to reassess the character of my dad. I don't necessarily question his existence. Well, to me, one fascinating aspect of the book of Job is that there is no flinching from suffering. In Christianity, there is no flinching from suffering. There are other religions, Hinduism and so on, which define suffering as somehow illusory, Maya. But not in Christianity. There's looking suffering right in the face. And yet, interestingly, in the book of Job, While a lot of people speculate, why is there suffering? It never occurs to anyone in the book to say that there's no God. It never occurs to Job to say God does not exist. That denial of God's existence is in some ways a modern phenomenon excavated out of contemporary suffering. Now, why is there suffering? Usually in thinking about this problem of suffering or problem of evil, we have to make a distinction between what can be called moral evil on the one hand and natural suffering on the other. So moral evil refers to bad things that are done by human beings. Moral agents do moral evil. And then, of course, there's natural suffering. I won't call it natural evil because there's nothing evil about a tsunami. A tsunami by itself isn't evil. Now, the wreckage it causes is terrible. But I'll call it natural suffering rather than natural evil because it's not performed by a human agent. So first we talk about moral evil. And in some senses, I think the defense raised by Bart Ehrmann, which he didn't actually rebut, was that moral evil is comprehensible within the framework of free will. It is a fact that if you are going to have free will, you're going to have to choose between right and wrong, between good and evil. To remove free will is to remove that ability to choose. It isn't necessarily to make us robots, but it is in some sense to make us inhuman. In fact, what do we call people who don't have the ability to choose right from wrong? We call them psychopaths or sociopaths. They're people, in a sense, who are less than human because they don't have that ability to choose. So when people often say, and Bart had a litany of moral horrors from Rwanda to the Holocaust to the killing fields of Cambodia, did God do those things? No. Human beings did them. Don't blame God for the Holocaust. That was Hitler and the Nazis. Who did the killing fields of Cambodia? Well, that was the atheist Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge regime, which in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, in 3 years, wiped out some 2 million people. Rwanda, the Hutus, the Tutsis, tribal hatreds, human beings inflicting terrible things on each other. And that is, in a sense, the great burden of moral choice. If you do something terrible, it's going to hurt innocent people who had no say in the matter. It gives you the awesome burden or responsibility of free choice. I'll come back and talk about the issue of free will in heaven, but in general, the argument that moral evil can be explained as a result of God creating us in His image, which is to say free like Him. In some senses, co-creators of circumstances in the universe. And that allows us to do some terrible things to each other. But then Bart rightly says that that's not the end of the story, because you do have terrible things that happen that human beings had nothing to do with. Tsunamis, hurricanes, natural suffering that seems to come out of, you might say, the laws of nature. And in some ways, Bart says if God is omnipotent, He could intervene. In fact, you might raise the question, why have laws of nature in the first place? No laws of nature, no hurricanes, no tsunamis, no earthquakes. Why did God create a lawful universe? Actually, there are some people who think He didn't. The Muslim scholar Al-Ghazali says there are no laws. God intervenes at every second to make things happen as they do. In some senses, the alternative to a lawful universe is, you might say, a discretionary universe. Everything happens because God wills it. And it doesn't have to happen the same way twice. So if you drop a pen, it goes to the ground, but the next time you drop it, it goes right up. That would be a whimsical universe, unpredictable. Now, try to think about this, because Bart said, free will cannot be used to defend against natural evil. I insist that it can. Because in a whimsical universe, human action would have no predictable consequence. If I were to pull out a gun to shoot you, God could block the bullet. And therefore my action of trying to kill you, my evil action, is meaningless because you're not going to feel any pain. Because a magical hand is going to come in the way and whisk off the bullet. So in other words, if we don't have a lawful universe, In some senses, human action in the world becomes impossible. Our freedom, we might still be free, but our freedom would carry no consequence because it would be completely unpredictable what was going to happen next. Now, of course, we could still have a lawful universe with miracles. In other words, let's have laws, but God just intervenes like once in a while, maybe every 6 weeks. Not intervenes with little nuisances. He doesn't block the common cold, but maybe he blocks the horrible hurricanes and tsunamis that kill tens of thousands of people. Now, interestingly, when you look at the Bible, there are a lot of miracles. But to my understanding, these miracles, by and large, are aimed at, you might say, spiritual benefits, and not to contravene the laws of nature for their own sake. In other words, God parts the Red Sea for the Israelites to cross. Jesus heals the blind man, but he doesn't heal blindness. The purpose is conversion. It's spiritual. There is a contravention of a law of nature, but it's occasional, it's rare, and it's done for a spiritual purpose. At no point can I find miracles that are done just because God decides that this law... In fact, think about it. If God had to do miracles that way, it's kind of a way of saying that my laws are defective. I create a factory to spit out cars, but a bad one comes out every now and then. I've got to do a miracle to correct it. That's a defect. Why do we have earthquakes? The reason we have earthquakes, and by the way, this is not an argument from the Bible, this is an argument from geology. The reason we have earthquakes is underneath the earth are massive tectonic plates that move. And these tectonic plates, it turns out, are absolute prerequisites for life on Earth to exist. In fact, interestingly, scientists have looked for plate tectonics and have not found them on any other known star or planet. They are unique to Earth. And the point I'm getting at here is not merely that you need plate tectonics, because plate tectonics ultimately separate the land from the oceans. If you didn't have plate tectonics, our planet, mostly made up of water, the water would swallow the land, and Earth would be essentially a water world up to a depth of about 400 feet. I get this fact from a book called Rare Earth, written by the geologist Peter Ward and the astronomer Donald Brownlee. The point being that plate tectonics is an absolute prerequisite for life itself to exist on the Earth. And here we can make a broader point. And that is, as scientists study the laws of nature, all the laws, the constants of nature, the speed of light, the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, they have come up with something that is sometimes called the anthropic principle, or the principle of fine-tuning. And here's what it means. The laws of the universe are fine-tuned for life. You could have other laws, but if you did, you would not end up with creatures like us. You might not end up with life at all, but if you did, you would not get human beings at the end. There's a rather startling theological point hiding here. The anthropic principle, by the way, usually used to try to prove the existence of some kind of an intelligent designer. I'm not using it for that purpose. I'm saying something a little different. Modern science shows that this universe cannot function with other laws. That if you had other laws, you wouldn't get Homo sapiens at the end of it. So yes, God could have made other laws, but you'd get a different kind of creature at the end of the process. So if God wanted to use a lawful process and wanted to create creatures like us, modern science tells us that this is the recipe. The laws that exist here and now are the necessary prerequisite for us being here. Now, these laws are in some senses double-edged. The sunshine that makes life possible is also the sunshine that gives us wrinkles and sometimes exposes us to radiation, cancer. The water that we drink without which we couldn't have life, well, you can drown in it. And so these laws are of such a kind that they can by themselves impose hardship, impose suffering. But here's the other side of it. God has at the same time given us the tools to comprehend these laws and in some ways to overcome them. That is called modern science. And therefore, you can have malaria, but we have a cure for malaria. If you want to know why people are getting malaria, right now and suffering and dying from it, that's because this cure that we have already is not being adequately and widely enough distributed. It exists. The fault, in other words, here is not with a God who allows malaria, but with human beings who do not take the actions to, in a sense, achieve the kind of world that God made it possible for us to live in. Thank you very much.